All right, we got some folks in here. Welcome everybody. Today I'm really excited to talk with all of you about orchestral saxophone playing. This is something that really kind of, if you go way back to the original intention of the instrument, this is what Adolf Sax had in mind as a kind of a sonic bridge between low woodwinds and low brass. As we know, the orchestral instrumentation and the majority of the standard repertoire for the orchestra had already been written at the point of our invention, but it's still, this has played a really important part of my career. I get so much enjoyment out of playing with orchestra and just the experience alone. So I thought, and I know James and Steve both also feel the same way, so we're really excited to talk to you about this today. So I am Nathan Nabb, professor of saxophone at Stephen F. Austin, and along with me we have James Bunte and Steve Temme. Guys, why don't you just talk a little bit about who you are?
Sure. My name is James Bunte. I'm the professor of saxophone at the College Conservatory of Music at the University of Cincinnati. Yeah, we'll talk about orchestral experience in just a second.
Yeah, and I'm Stephen Temme, based in Washington, D.C. now. I've been playing with the Marine Band for the past about 16, 17 years. And yeah, the D.C. region and the orchestras here, so look forward to talking about that. Thanks again, Nathan, for putting this on, and it's just been so great to check in on these from time to time, and all the information I'm getting even now is wonderful, so thanks.
Well, appreciate that. Thank you. So I thought we would just first start about, and talk about each one of our backgrounds in orchestral playing. And so mine really started back in 2003, the 2003-2004 season. And my first concerts with orchestra were with other than concerts in school orchestras. I should say that I did have some experience playing in some sections in school orchestras, but my first quote unquote non-academic or professional engagement was with New World Symphony down in Miami Beach, and that is really really a very, very, very high level top quality orchestra. Although it's considered a training orchestra, the people coming out of there and being placed into are being placed into orchestras all over the country on a really consistent basis. It's amazingly high level playing, and it's a fellowship situation there. And so I think, if it's still the same, that a traditional fellowship there is a 3-year engagement. So the understanding is that you're there for 3 years. Playing an orchestra. At the time, their living expenses were paid for. Everybody stayed in the Plymouth Hotel, and my understanding is that has changed. But it was a 3-year fellowship, and then the idea was within that amount of time, you were supposed to go out and audition for a position in a full-time orchestra. That was started by Leonard Bernstein and was taken over by Michael Tilson Thomas, and he is still the music director at New World. I played also in that season with the Iris Chamber Orchestra out of Germantown, Tennessee, which is a suburb of Memphis. And at the very end of that season, I started playing with St. Louis Symphony. So, and from there, for the next 4 years, I played with New World, off and on with Iris for a couple of years, and fortunately I'm still playing with St. Louis. So this was my 16th season playing with St. Louis Symphony, and I have been playing with Houston Symphony since I moved to Texas in 2010. So I'm finishing my 10th season with them. So I've played with Minnesota Orchestra as well, and have played with, of course, several other regional orchestras in addition to that. So guys, you guys want to give your backgrounds?
Sure. I was lucky enough to get a chance to play with the Cincinnati Symphony in 2000. So I actually played this would be my 20th year of performing with the Cincinnati Symphony, and pops. I've been lucky enough to do a lot of pop shows too, and many of the other I've been very lucky to get the chance to play with fantastic other orchestras, including Lexington and Louisville and Columbus and the Kentucky Symphony and a lot of the smaller regional orchestras too. But each one has been fantastic to get the chance to play the rep. And I also played one time with Minnesota Orchestra, lucky enough to do that too. And this last year, I recorded my 10th CD with the Cincinnati Symphony and Pops, which is remarkable because I'm not sure how many more chances I'm going to get to do that. So that's been pretty tremendous as well. Amazing learning opportunity. We might talk about recording a bit later.
Very good. I have to take it to the way back, junior high and high school, because it was, for me, so formational. I grew up in the Phoenix area, and I quickly outgrew kind of our city-wide youth wind program. So I started playing with the Phoenix Youth Orchestra in high school, playing the saxophone repertoire, but also I found out they were going on tour with this repertoire, and they were going to let me go if I could play clarinet. So I started learning, sitting at the end of the section and learning clarinet on like Symphony Fantastique and Prokofiev Violin Concerto, like so awkward. But I got to play Romeo and Juliet and On the Town on tour with the Phoenix Symphony Youth Orchestra, and it was so formational at that time. And those pieces just stay with you when you're learning it at such a young age. And so I really draw still deeply on that early experience. And then, of course, in school, I went to Indiana and played with the Bloomington Pops and some regional orchestras in Evansville there. And then I did 2 years in Paris studying at a conservatory there. And a friend of mine, a couple of friends, were on tour with the Verbier Festival Orchestra that came through Paris. And I saw that concert there and was just blown away by that ensemble. I think Rostropovich was conducting, and it was incredible. And I found out that they had regional auditions in London. So I went up there, and they weren't necessarily auditioning for a saxophone, but I engaged them to see if they would hear me. And sure enough, I went up and played, and I received a kind of a welcoming letter that, you know, whatever work may come along. And sure enough, they had, I think, 3 seasons worth of saxophone music. Unfortunately, I could only do one, as I was back here in DC by that time, and I couldn't do them all. But I did get to spend a summer, a couple weeks in the summer in Switzerland with that orchestra, and could do a recital there and all the things associated with the festival, which was another just tremendous experience. So landing here in DC was about 2003, and you know, I just tried to play as much as I could when I got here in recitals and whatnot. And so I received a call pretty much out of the blue a couple years after I had been here from the Baltimore Symphony personnel manager, and it was for a pop show. And funny enough, I think all the orchestras here, the National Symphony and the Philly Orchestra, I've all started with pop shows and kind of morphed into more legit playing and the standard repertoire. But I started in Baltimore about the same season as Maren Alsop was taking over as music director there. And so that's been about 10 seasons with her up there. And from time to time with the National Symphony here, the Kennedy Center Opera House Orchestra, and various regional, really great regional orchestras, Fairfax Symphony in the area. And then probably for the past 3 seasons, I've been playing with the Philadelphia Orchestra and getting to know the kind of the scene up there.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So, I think one of the other things that we thought would be really interesting for everybody is to understand like how we got into doing this. And these experiences vary super widely. I know Steve, you were talking about union showcases. There are union showcases. There are extra auditions. There are, of course, word of mouth and knowing people that play in their groups. Like how did you guys start to get your experiences?
My first experience, Stephen reminded me of that I need to go to the way back too. Just that my first actual professional orchestra experience was because of my teacher Tom Meyer at University of Colorado Boulder. I got the chance to play with the summer music festival there, which is amazing. And when I moved to Cincinnati and I graduated with my master's degree, that was when I got a chance, and it was in my case, it wasn't an extra audition. It was just word of mouth. So I think the person who was playing with the Cincinnati Symphony at the time asked my teacher, Rick Van Meter, who he might suggest to play Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances, and I was incredibly grateful to do it, and that started a good relationship with the section and the personnel manager, and I started getting called more frequently after that. I did take one extra audition once with the Louisville Philharmonic Orchestra, and that was a pretty interesting experience too, and that's how I got to play with them a few times too.
So what was that experience like?
That was the only chance I've had outside of the President's Marine Band of taking a professional audition behind a screen, and they actually called it's the only chance we saxophonists might get to play that kind of a high pressure 3-minute audition where you just get to play a couple excerpts and that was it. There was only one round, and they let me know by letter that I was acceptable and on the list. So, but that not quite the same kind of high pressure that a normal clarinet or flute or violin person would have to go through multiple rounds, etc.
No.
What was the showcase like, Stephen? Do you know?
I actually haven't done a showcase. I just know they exist. So, and I think in some cities, the union will provide a platform for players to essentially, it's kind of a recital format. And a lot of contractors show up and hear the recital, and they form a list of subs or extras based on that. So I know that has existed before in Baltimore. I'm not sure if every city does that or whatnot. Mine, like I kind of mentioned, was just from playing in DC area as much as I could when I got here. I didn't find out for, 6 or 7 years how I ever got hired until finally understanding that another saxophonist who was subbing in Baltimore had heard me play on a recital. I think it was at the Navy Symposium regionally here. That's just a great series and format to play in, and so someone was attending and they had just heard my recital and thought, well, I'll put him on the list for the personnel manager. So that was kind of the way I got called the first time, and then it's been as different as like I mentioned in Verbier was a situation like James mentions with more of an audition situation. From my first experience to the National Symphony was because a colleague of mine in the Marine Band, that person's spouse, I think, worked in some capacity at the Kennedy Center, and they were doing a new music festival, which had a saxophone part in a Mark Anthony Turnage piece. It was really, really cool. But anyway, so that was more of knowing somebody, and my name got mentioned. So I think there are so many different ways that you find yourself in this kind of work.
Right. Yeah. For me, I actually, I grew up 30 minutes east of St. Louis in Southern Illinois. And so St. Louis Symphony was the orchestra I grew up hearing. And I knew of New World because when I was at Northwestern, there was several people always taking auditions for New World Symphony. And I thought, hey, it's supposed to be a fantastic orchestra in Miami Beach. And so two awesome things I was interested in. So I actually I sent my materials to uh, the personnel manager at New World, and just to see what would happen. I mean, they did not have at that point a standardized audition. Um, Many orchestras, as I think we mentioned, or maybe this was last time when we were talking, but they have extra auditions. So, like James was talking about with Louisville, where you go in and you play some excerpts. But at that time, New World wasn't having them, so I sent my materials to them, and lo and behold, I got a call, and that really started a really such a formative and important experience for me. That time and getting to go down there and play with that orchestra, just it meant the world to me. And then later on, so my first concert with them, actually, I played La Lesienne, and not quite as high pressure as Rachmaninoff, but not low pressure either. And but then my first concert with St. Louis, I actually played the Belshazzar's Feast. Have either one of you done that? That was Walton.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
it's a full orchestra and full choir. It's a really interesting piece. So anyway, that's I wrote New World out of the blue and sent them some recordings, and I was fortunate enough to get a call. But I mean, really, what it shows is how many different ways, I guess, that you can get work in this field. It's by audition, by, I guess, just deciding you're going to send your stuff to somebody and see if they listen, or by just somebody hearing. I mean, that's a really cool story, Steve, about just people just hearing your performance and deciding that you were going to be on the list. That's
Yeah, just having no idea, but it's also cool in the reverse now, where I'm able to do the same,
right.
because I cannot handle all of the things that happen throughout the season, and being able to pass that on is really incredible too.
Yeah, of course. So, all right. So the next topic we wanted to cover, which I thought would be an interesting one, is what's the most important thing you've learned by playing an orchestra, and how has that affected your playing outside of orchestra? Does anybody want to go first?
Steve, why don't you go first?
Okay. Yeah, and we had mentioned this question last night, thinking about it more and more. And the most important thing that I've learned is really, the more I think about it, my place in the larger scope of a work, of a piece of music, and so context, basically, and really having an awareness of my part, whether it is more of a solo part or if it's section playing. I mean, even in a solo situation, how that's fitting in with the overall scope or arc of a work. And so for me, it's highly contextual, and it's directly applied to any chamber music I do. And I can say I've really benefited from just being aware of how the saxophone fits in to the different colors that a composer is using. Why did some composer use a saxophone with this group of woodwinds, or with strings, or why is that color important, and what is the context surrounding it? So there's just this kind of otherworldly awareness that you have to have of why that matters, and what's my place in it. I think without that, you can send the wrong message sometimes, especially if you're just blowing all out, or even as a section, if it's just too much, if it's too little, so really having an understanding for me has been so valuable, and it applies in my work with the Marine Band, certainly. And I feel very fortunate anyway to play just all the time with large ensemble, and where the same thing, context is really everything, and understanding where you're at in the overall picture.
Yeah. So yeah, and I know we all probably can agree. It depending on what piece you're thinking of, depending on what, there are certain things you take away from different styles of music that you're playing or whatever else. But I think overall, for me, my biggest takeaway and how it's affected my playing overall is the sense of time and understanding both the in terms of pragmatic sense of time, like playing in time with a group, listening across, looking forward, and understanding, okay, well, some conductors prefer that you play behind the beat, some conductors want you to play on top of the beat, and I'm sure that that's a big difference for you, Steve, going from bands to orchestra.
Definitely.
And so there's that part of it, but also like the expressive sense of time, like how you notes and music have a place, and placing something where it needs to be, by listening, especially across the woodwind section, just when they either have section playing or solo playing within it. It's just a master class every time I go and sit down with people, like listening to how somebody plays within that tradition, and knowing, how, where they place that note, how long it sits before they move on to the next, like the expressive use of time, and really that's to me, that applies to solo playing, it applies to chamber playing, it applies to large ensemble playing, and the more we think about, the more, we tend to think of expression as, you need to direct to here, but how that motion, that line is moving with or actually against the sense of time, to me, in understanding that kind of, that sense, it was my biggest takeaway from orchestra.
Cool. Both of you, when you're talking about this stuff, it reminds me of all the things I learn every time I go. Every time you get to sit with these fantastic musicians, and I try to tell my students when they play with the CCM orchestra, try to listen as much as you can, because it's a master class in things that we don't get to do every day. It's a master class in blend and balance and understanding how to be a perfect section player, and you have those 4 solo notes come out in that perfect way. I guess since time has already been mentioned, and blend balance, I would say that the other thing I learned is amazing control of intonation, and it's incredibly inspiring to be sitting in an orchestra that's playing absolutely in tune, and they really are not caring about, all the time about, are we 440, 441 or whatever. It's all contextual. It's all what's happening in the music at the time, and being perfect blend, balance, and in tune with the people you're playing with. Sometimes that's trumpet and cello, and sometimes that's horn and bassoon, and everyone just has to listen throughout the orchestra. I'm always amazed at how effortless that sounds and how difficult it really is to do. So I think one of the things I've learned how to do, and I hopefully take to any chamber playing I do, is understand how every intonation and blend moment is unique to the section. That's why we're going to hopefully talk about score study and stuff. It's important for us to know where we are and who we're playing with.
Right. So, yeah. So let's get a little bit more on the pragmatic side of it now. Like, what do you wish you would have known before you first started playing with orchestra?
I wish I would have understood how important, this is a big difference if you play with band a lot, right, Stephen? That you're much more connected with the exact time of the stick. With at least I felt that way with Alan McMurray and Eugene Corporon. Felt like the stick time was so important in placing, and how in an orchestra the conductor is so much more expressive, and the ensemble listens more than it watches for exact time. And then all the expressive stuff coming from the podium adds an entire level. I wish I would have understood that a bit more, because it was quite a shock to hear how far back the orchestra played for the conductor's ictas. That was tricky for me.
Yeah, I do first want to underscore the point that we're all talking about time, and something I really love now, but it is unsettling at first, is, being on a stage with the orchestra, that it feels so wide, and the depth, like you feel the space around you. And for some reason, one beat at any, doesn't matter what the tempo is, it just seems like there's so much to choose from of where to where to place something, because the space surrounding you just, it feels so wide. So that's certainly always always a thing whenever playing with orchestra, and to learn. For me, what I wish I knew, some of it's a little bit more practical and logistical, because a lot of the work I did at first was playing in a section, and I suppose when you're showing up, you don't, at least for me, I didn't always know who else it was going to be, what kind of style, and even that way, what kind of equipment am I going to need? And yeah, it's a little, your first time walking into something can be unsettling that way. Just, you want to be as prepared as possible. So, I think I feel it out a little bit more now, or I feel a little more able to ask what the makeup of a section, or maybe I'm putting the section together, so it's a little different. But early on, I think just having an awareness of who else is coming to the job, to be in the section, and how are you going to fit into that and work, as a team. So just that awareness, and I wanting to know how I needed to be prepared would have really been useful early on.
Yeah, and so I agree. That's something that, and what we can hit on that a little bit later in terms of section playing and equipment and all that stuff. I think, and awareness too. But the thing I wish I probably first would have known is also just pragmatic stuff. So like, now I know if I'm contracted for an orchestra that I've not played with before, I ask what pitch they tune to. Even to just like, when you're practicing to get 442 in your ear versus where you might normally play. And so understanding, also the scale of your horn at 442 is different than it is at 440. And those kinds of things. So knowing to up front, if it's not in the higher letter, to ask, what is the concert dress? I mean, because as we all know, matinee dress is different than Saturday night dress, right? So, and which is different in Baltimore than it is in Houston.
Little story. Do you mind if I
go?
Because the last time I played was right before all this, everything shut down. So it was the week before, and sure enough, I brought a tux up to Philly, and it was a weekend of shows, but they have a Friday matinee, and it's just never in my head that it's a 3:00 show. And it dawns on me Thursday night after that performance, oh my gosh, I think the dress is different. So there you go. I went and bought a black suit.
Well, have an extra suit. Yeah, I mean, so and summer festival dress is different than, and so knowing all that stuff and being prepared, when I go and play in St. Louis now, I have a suit that just lives. I stay with my folks because it's not that far away. So that was the beautiful thing, is I get to visit my family when I play with them. But I have a suit that lives there, just in the closet, in case, I don't notice that because there are Friday coffee concerts sometimes that are also the case, like 10:30 concert or whatever. So, yeah, kind of knowing just the pragmatic ground level of being prepared for the dress. I mean, in some places are actually really specific. I remember that originally one of the orchestras I played with, it specified patent leather shoes with tails, and what they called executive length dress socks, which was like up to the knees to make sure there wasn't any ankle showing. So, very specific things that, like if you don't know to ask about, you can show up out of code, so to speak. So anyway, those are, just a few of the things that, just aside from outside of the music, outside of preparing your music, just you need to be aware of. Most of us because we don't play regularly in orchestra in college. I mean, I had to buy a tailscope the first time I played because I had a tux for concert band, but not a tailscope. So that's also just
Yeah, I would say nearly half of it is just showing up on time at the right place with the right clothes. In the DC area, I mean, I leave at 6 a.m. to get to Baltimore. I mean, it just depends where you are and accounting for all that, traffic, logistics, rehearsal order. Are you going to be waiting around? When is it going to be your turn? There's all these details, and
Right.
they're important.
Of course, and I mean, it's better to show up an hour and a half early than 1 minute late, So I'm always at the hall way ahead of time, because worried about traffic or all that stuff. So, okay, so I thought we can also talk about just like the aspects of playing in orchestra, specific things. And what have your findings been with? Well, we can start with time since we were talking about time. I have my own thoughts about certain pieces that require, something like pictures requires a totally different sense of time than something like any Bernstein or Gershwin or Rachmaninoff. They all have different skill sets. So you guys, either one of you want to take the lead on that, discussing that sense of time?
Well, this for me goes back to that a little bit of that either score study or listening study, understanding who you're playing with. For example, in pictures, if you know exactly if you get to hear if you're really listening for that bassoon and cello ostinato, the dom dom dom, that you realize that it's very different than playing with a metronome, and you have to really be placing that in a specific way. Whereas there's a much more it's a very different thing when you're playing the like you said, the Bernstein stuff, where it has to be, it's very groove oriented, where you're thinking of the that kind of stuff is just it's very different feeling. So it's I think score study is part of the time preparation, but absolutely never be ahead of the other musicians.
So how do you practice that?
I absolutely believe in the thing that I did on my own presentation, where I'm playing my excerpts with the beat, ahead of the beat, and behind the beat, so I can feel how it feels to pull and push on the time itself. Because I think that it's easy to say, well, you always just put it down the middle, but when you're listening across to the cellos, boy, that is a very tricky thing to do. You better be, it's like Steve was saying, that the time is so wide, the beat is so wide that you have to be pretty good at placing it.
I thought I liked what was your term for that, time feel, James?
What?
Your term for that, was it time feel? And just how you explained that, I thought was really cool. Because I've always thought, in another sense, there's not a lot of ways to practice it. It's kind of, you're there and you're experiencing this. And for me, it has been just building on experience, what that's like. But it's also really sharpened my ears, just listening so intently. And what's really cool is the nuance that starts to develop. If an orchestra on one night plays something a little differently the next couple of sessions, you know, it's not always going to go the same way. And so, you know, being so tuned in with your ears, and I think of that symphonic dances part that where you're this chamber section and the saxophone solo and how that's all lining up and integrated. You know, there's awareness of the conductor and the beat, but you're really listening just to those other solo voices that you're joining and weaving in and out of. So just the sharpening of the ear has been fantastic.
Yeah. And so there's a specific technique, a practice technique that Susan Slaughter, and I think I forget who I mentioned this to or when I would have mentioned it, but I mean, probably 12 or 15 years ago, Susan Slaughter, she was the principal trumpet in St. Louis Symphony for, I think, maybe 50 years, but if not, very close to it in the 40s. And unbelievable player, unreal, never missed, always beautiful playing, just a complete model of what a principal trumpet should be. And I remember her explaining how she practiced it, because the other thing that we all know is that depending on the hall that you're in and depending on where you are at the stage, the sense of sound and the time that it takes for it to travel is very different. And saxophone, almost always, when you're playing in the section, is along with, you know, next to the bass clarinet, or sometimes on the other side with bassoon, but which is towards the back of the hall. And she explained it this way, that she would take a metronome and the recorder that she used, and set the recorder right down to the next to the metronome and walk 40 feet away and play in time with the metronome.
Love it.
Get used to practicing that. So that when you would go back and listen to the recording, you hear how much you're delayed. Just, you know, in that. So you can immediately tell, like, oh, I need to be this far in front of it by the time it gets back to me and by the time my sound gets forward, so that I'm in time with what's going on in the rest of the group. And I was just like, it was so smart. I loved hearing that. And it, of course, it seems like, well, yeah, that makes total sense, but it's not an obvious thing. At least it wasn't to me, in order to figure out, you know, how much of a delay there is in the sound. And of course, the sound is also going side to side, not just front to back. And so, you know, the feedback that you get from the hall and everything else, you have to really be listening closely. But kind of going back to what James was saying about pictures, even with pictures, the bassoon entrance and the articulation and the immediacy of that articulation is a different thing than the cello articulation, the ostinato you're playing. And so you have to understand also that, and the cellos are further away from you than the bassoon is. And so knowing that, all right, that sense of time is going to change, and just being ready for that, and being, you know, and especially depending on the orchestra, if the conductor wants everything very, very, very soft, sometimes it's really hard to hear a clear front on those articulations. So being able to know where that's supposed to be placed is one of the biggest challenges. But
I would say that this is the thing that I wish all saxophonists could get out of these ideas, is that this is the thing that helps us when we're playing with piano or in a quartet or any other chamber ensemble, is being able to play expressively and beautifully, and, you know, the way we want to do it, all at the same time that we're listening outside of our own part, and being able to that's what makes a good chamber player. So, you know, being a good orchestral saxophonist is just being a great chamber player.
Definitely.
yeah, so then, you know, what about like balance and blend? How do you guys think of that within the orchestra? What do you do to prepare it? You know, your part for a specific piece, like you know, symphonic dances, or the Bernstein symphonic dances, or Prokofiev. What do you guys do in order thinking about balance and blend ideas? Anybody? I can go. You want me to go?
You go first.
Okay. So I think the number one thing in this case is to know the scores. So these are, you know, this is Gershwin, American in Paris, or, you know, Mio, Creation of the World. Knowing who you're playing with knowing the tendencies of the instruments that you play with, what kind of vibrato that those instruments would normally use. Um, Imagining a beautiful, oboe or bassoon articulation, or um, the flute sound in a certain range that they're playing in with you. I mean, again, Rachmaninoff is a perfect example. You have to know how to blend with clarinet, oboe, and flute, because the solo that you're playing, which isn't truly a solo, is going against and with all of those instruments at the same time. And so just thinking about those instruments and the tone color of those instruments and finding a reference point for that always helps me kind of come up with the sound that I want in those spots.
And
And I was lucky enough to play Rachmaninoff again this last year with the Dayton Philharmonic, and what was interesting was that I felt like I should change my sound when it was switching off from kind of the oboe. There's a little oboe duet, and then it switches, and you really have to be with the flute kind of by just the two of you. And I felt like I had to soften up my sound so that it would blend better, so that you can really get into some interesting ideas about tone color that when you're doing this stuff.
yeah, and I think knowing when to push it a little bit and when not to. Although I often err on the side of being a little more subtle in the playing. And it's been my experience where it really doesn't take much effort or blowing or dynamic to let your sound into this hall. It's going to speak very clearly. And it's also been my experience more often to get the hand a little bit. Not always the case, because again, it's this awareness of how important is this part and this color of the saxophone in this work. Maybe that opening in West Side Story made, it's setting a color there. It's important versus another kind of 2D section. But my experience has just been, it doesn't take so much to let the sound go. I mean, it's going to be very vibrant in the hall, and if it is often, a solo part, it's going to carry. So understanding that nuance and how much to press or really not press is another big thing for me.
Yeah. So along these lines, and this is not something that we had talked about before, but I think an interesting idea would be talk about reed selection in a concert hall setting versus a recital hall setting versus a chamber or a recording session setting. Like, I think that whenever you hear, like, when you sit next to these folks, and as you were saying, Steve, I mean, it doesn't take a lot. The saxophone is an instrument that projects very well, just naturally on its own. But these folks that are used to playing in a concert hall are moving their air in a different way than you're used to doing in a maybe in a practice room, for sure. So my reeds, if a reed, you don't want a fuzzy reed, but if a reed has just a little bit of that in it, and it'll project a little bit more in a concert hall, and that slight amount of fuzz gives like a beautiful halo to the sound, versus if you play a reed that's on the softer side and you get in there, it tends to project. And of course, some of this is contextual, but depending on the hall you're playing in. But the hall amplifies your sound; it's part of your instrument. And so, if it's a slightly softer reed, it will amplify a thinner, less deep or resonant sound. I don't know if you guys have the same experiences or not.
I think that
Tend to play a tiny bit harder reeds just in the hall, because I especially because of the incredible purity that you in the way that the instruments blend. I don't want that little bit of buzz on the sound. It just helps to blend. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's good. I can't say that I change things too much, other than the awareness of it's going to sound crystal clear in these halls where I'm playing at. And I was telling these guys last night too that I switched in the past few years. I've been playing on Legers pretty much exclusively. And even within those, there's of course a range of what Nate is saying about a little harder or softer, and that's going to get amplified. And I agree. I think that's definitely the case. But I've enjoyed the response that I'm getting, and the sound I've been able to work with that setup, which lends itself to another really practical issue of just sitting there forever and then and then playing. It's another, well, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a bit, but it's another aspect of this kind of work that's so unique. As many of you know, I mean, these excerpts come few and far between, and in a huge work, maybe you're playing a little line 20 minutes in or whatever, and it's got to be right there. So I've taken a mental comfort from the setup I'm playing on now with the Legers, because I know that the response is going to be perfect. Yeah.
Have either one of you guys played the Wooden Prince?
No.
Bartok?
Bartok, yeah. That's a piece. It's a beautiful piece, but the saxophone enters way far into the piece, and it enters in octaves with the bari sax. It's alto and bari, and I swear to you, it must be 15 to 20 minutes into the piece, and that's the first time you play, and you're just sitting there,
yeah,
going cold, and then you have to play octaves with another instrument that's been sitting there. And so, you know, yes, the waiting game is a huge part of that, and being able to just go. I mean, luckily, Pictures, the solo happens early. Rachmaninoff, the solo happens early, and you get to listen, which is a treat in and of itself. But yeah, the waiting game is bad. So I mean, I still play cane reeds, but I understand certainly the appeal of the of the Leger 100%.
So we were gonna, since we're talking a little bit about equipment, do you wanna go to
Setups?
setup choices for pops, etc.?
Yeah, Steve, you wanna talk about that, Steve?
Sure. And I mentioned that early on as, you know, that was something I wanted to know what you're walking into. And I still always don't always know who's going to be joining in a section. But especially if I'm playing a pops show, and it can be Gershwin, you know, different players, different styles or aspects, and what that means for equipment. So I usually prepare, or it's not uncommon to prepare a jazz setup and a more legit setup, just to be prepared. And I'll practice the music in both of them. You know, whatever the sound that the conductor is looking for there. And if I don't have it on my current setup, maybe I can switch to something that's going to allow for that. So I like the flexibility there, just being prepared for it. Because I find it's quite wide ranging, you know, with who you're playing with. As far as I don't always know who that is, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, well, and the expectation of the music director as well. Like, are you going to be, you know, does he or she want, you know, on the Gershwin American of Paris, for instance, like, you know, on that opening section, do you want that to sound like a jazz band section from the 30s, or do you want it to sound like not?
Yeah, and I should say always with the caveat that your comfort and confidence still comes first, because I've also had the experience where I thought, well, maybe I'll put on a jazz setup with some of these other guys, and it was totally not me, and I was not feeling confident about that. This was in Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs, actually.
Oh yeah.
Which is, you know, it can go either way. I mean, we've done it in the Marine Band on all legit setups, and I've done it in other orchestras where people are playing on more open mouthpieces. And for that particular one, to me, being more confident in my playing meant sticking with a more the setup I was used to, even though the others weren't, and it worked, and I was able to produce the sound, and it all blended well. So I would say it does come down to your trust in yourself and what's gonna make you sound good too.
True, and I will say that it has changed for me over the years. I always used to play the Bernstein symphonic dances in American in Paris on classical setups all the time, and it just seems like the conductors I've been working with the last 5 or 6 years have wanted more of a jazz sound, and so as a section we kind of talk about it and decide maybe everyone doesn't have to change, but just our approach to how we want to do that. But I think you better be practicing both ways, because if you have to, as Stephen was saying, if you have to make a game time decision, you can't have practiced it on your classical setup and then just have the jazz setup out there and not have done it. Then you're not going to feel very confident. Also, it's important to say the conductor doesn't care about any of this. They don't care. They just want they want a certain sound, or they hear a certain thing in their head, and they're just gonna ask you for more of this. And it doesn't matter what setup you're on. Hopefully, you can be flexible to get different sounds. Hopefully, we're all that way. And our choices should be to just make things easier for ourselves, not to force it a certain way, but just to get that sound easier.
Right, it's a color palette range. That, yeah. So. Well, okay, so James, it sounds like there's a lot of communication within the section about either setups or at least approach. Stephen, it seems like at Cincinnati, and maybe not as much in Baltimore, depending on who's hired. You don't always know who's being hired along with you. Right. So, I mean, that speaks to the importance of being able to have both. If you show up and everybody else is on, they're Myers, and that's the direction that they want to go. And especially if you're playing a section part and the lead alto or principal player wants a certain sound, and you're not, you don't have that, it can be kind of a problem. So I think having both and being prepared on all sides of it is really, super important. So what about, we can kind of, by the way, if anybody has questions, go ahead and type them in. We can take some at the end. But we've been kind of surrounding this idea in the last couple of topics of just sound in general. And one of those ideas that we haven't quite talked about is use of vibrato. We have a tradition in our world of especially if you're playing solo recital with piano or chamber recitals, you can make your own decisions about vibrato and what tone color you want to use. How does playing with orchestra change that for you?
Well, I would just say that one of the things that we've said 3 or 4 times is just be aware of your surroundings and be very wide, more, have your biggest ears on. And I would say that if every orchestra is different, but that you don't want to have an incredible virtuosic vibrato that doesn't match, that makes you sound like you're not a member of this section. That would be a bad thing. So hopefully all of us have a wide variety of vibratos that we can play with, and we can pick one that's great for that moment, and not just say, okay, I'm going to play with my vibrato or whatever that is.
Sure, I think it is highly, of course, dependent on the music, and just like I teach it, is it's a tool to warm up the sound. Is it appropriate? Does it feel good to warm it up or give a little sweetness on a certain passage? It's so wide ranging. And I think we all hear so many different ways that these things are played. And again, I think it's being true to yourself and how you are interpreting this excerpt, this piece, and how are you being most expressive. So I think it's such a personal decision.
Yeah. I guess along those lines, also being historically informed about, we had talked about, some of the old recordings of Bernstein with, him conducting New York Phil. You hear kind of exactly some of the sounds that, he certainly had in mind, or at least that he was writing for, these pieces were recorded. And the story about the Rachmaninoff with trying to decide between voice or saxophone, whether or not what to use. I mean, certainly, if not voice, then he's at least thinking of the saxophone in terms of in a vocal nature. Like, so how to reference that in your playing, and how to balance that against the other instruments. And so, I guess maybe just understanding contextual, also being aware, and being aware. Not just of who you're playing with, but who you're at the time, but who you're handing a line off to, or everything else. Just knowing the music and making decisions about that, and balancing your preparation against what's happening in the moment.
Yeah, I love your.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just love your comment about the knowing where it's coming from and the sort of lineage of a piece or a work. And I had mentioned to these guys that I had gone down and seen Al Regni a couple times, who played with the New York Phil for so many years, and the National Symphony, and just this gorgeous sound and vibrato, but very, like, it was a style for that time. And going back and back, even to the maybe clarinet players who were playing these saxophone parts. And how does that inform? I think it's very, very important. I don't think it means you copy it, but I think it informs your understanding of the role that the horn has in that piece. And while you're not copying it, you're bringing that influence, and it's informing your playing.
Yeah. So I think maybe the one other tip that we all had was, in reference to being aware. Also, like, remember that from the time you're on stage, you're performing, and so our warm-ups, even, think about, you don't want to show up on stage and be playing a bunch of super virtuosic saxophonistic line. Warming up on Albright, that's not the right time to practice your Albright. It's not the right time to practice some of our more modern pieces. It's in there, it's about tone, finding your sound with the ensemble. Even when you're warming up and they're playing whatever, you can still listen for sound and still find that sound and be thinking about how you're wrestling against that even then. So you guys have any final thoughts you want to throw in, or we don't have any questions so far, but any other final thoughts?
I think that's a good point that I'll follow up on. Is you're a guest in somebody's space, and there are these things that are a little unsaid, but be cool in the space. Just you want to get to know people. You want to be responsive to the personnel manager. All the things you would think, but maybe take a little reminding and be aware of your surroundings. It's just really important, and even when you're not playing, and where you're at, and so there's that awareness aspect that is super important to me, paired with what I mentioned earlier about waiting, and not only waiting within a piece of music, but waiting over 4 or 5 days of this rehearsal and concert process, where you might play a 2-minute line and you're someplace for a week, and you're jumping in and out of high pressure, nothing. And it's challenging over the scope of a week, I'll say. It's phenomenal. I love the experience every time, but it's a certain headspace, and I like to just be mentally aware and prepared for that.
I would say, boy, it's fun to hear you guys talk about this stuff, because it reminds me of all the things that I learned in this process. I will say that if I had any advice for people who want to do this more, it's to remember that we're a very small part of what's going on, and we want to be as incredibly prepared as we can be for that small part, and just do all the things. Be as prepared so that our part is effortless and comes off exactly the way we want. But always be in the mindset that we're a guest there.
Yeah, and that you represent saxophonists, and so for those of us who aren't who are guests, always be thinking about what kind of impression you make, and prepared and on time, and with playing with a beautiful sound, and communicative, and I mean that's just a huge part of it right there.
Yeah.
Jacob Lemons wrote, in performance scenarios where you have a long time before you play, how do you keep your horn warm without drawing attention to yourself? Yeah, how do you mentally prepare for that situation as well?
So I have two things that I do to keep my horn warm. I actually don't think it's an amazing idea to keep blowing warm air for 20 minutes at a time, because I feel like that creates condensation, then you're going to have problems. So I think you can keep the horn on your lap where two parts of it are, and then your hands on top where you can keep it more warm. The reed is another issue. If you're using cane reeds, you have to keep them somewhat wet, or make sure you have a mouthpiece cap that, the properly wet reeds, and then make sure that your cap is on and is ready to go. I think if you know that it's going to be 20 minutes of silence before you play, you need to practice that way. You need to get ready to go. Put your horn on your lap for 20 minutes, put out the tuner, and see how you are when you pick it up and play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great practice technique. And I remember doing that, just leaving the horn for a while, coming back, picking it up and playing an excerpt, and how'd it go? Because, again, I think that's part of the mental thing, is knowing that you're just going to be doing it at the moment. And, keeping the horn, I always keep it close to my body and my hand on the neck, and if I need to blow a little air, I might right before I play or something. And I remember I used water when I was playing on cane reeds, and I think you can, I would soak them at an appropriate and subtle time. Probably not before playing a big excerpt or something, but if it's in between something, it's fine. Again, just being subtle is key.
Yeah. Yeah, and knowing, the one point about being subtle that's super important is, like, everybody else in your row and in front of you, behind you, is also in a high pressure situation when, so if you're going to be moving at all, know when it's okay and know when it isn't. So you don't want to be making any moves while the person next to you has a solo. No, I mean, seriously, that just like that of course that seems obvious, but be respectful, again, be aware.
I didn't know, just one quick comment about being respectful and aware. I actually didn't know the first time I played that it was pretty rude to turn around and look at someone when they're playing a solo, whereas in a jazz band, it would be probably fine. Orchestral members find that pretty rude if you're spinning around to look at principal trumpet when he's playing a solo. So I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I guess that's something you find out the hard way, maybe. Evan Gidley wrote a quick comment. I'm the personnel manager of the Columbus Symphony and a saxophonist. I found that most personnel managers do not know good saxophone playing, just as I don't understand good harp playing, for example. So when hiring for less commonly played instruments, he typically listens to recommendations from 1, the music director, 2, the first call musician who's unavailable, or 3, principal players of similar instruments. So the more you can network with these people, the better. Personnel manager is not typically the one making the hiring decisions. It's a great point.
Very good point. And I've found each of those to be the case, but I mean, I think it's also very wide ranging, but all of that is so true. And I don't know if we talked about this either, but some orchestras seem to use different sets of lists depending on the repertoire. And who's making those decisions, I'm not always clear as to the music director or the personnel, usually the personnel manager, and their understanding of what's needed. So I played in a couple orchestras where that's definitely the case. There are different lists, but then not. There's maybe one list for certain places. And, so a lot to me does come down to what the personnel manager is understanding or knows, or that principal clarinetist who might be making the recommendations for the hiring.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, great guys. I really appreciate you both doing this. And Stephanie, a bit off topic. What are your thoughts on transcription for solo saxophone? Stephanie, I tell you what. Write us a message on Facebook, and we'll be happy to answer you. Okay. You guys, thank you for doing this. And great as always to talk to you.
Thank you.
It's great together. This has been really fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll see you.
Thanks.